So before we dive more into what we eat, I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of that first theme or that first topic, and that is maintaining a healthy body weight. So in terms of using body weight, we use a term called BMI or body mass index, which really is just a way to standardize our height and our weight. And this is something that you can get from your doctor. They should have it calculated in your medical record, or even our good old friend Google can calculate this for you. And what the illustration on this slide is intended to show is that as our weight or our BMI increases, our risks for certain types of cancers can increase as well. So our goal is to try to maintain our weight within that healthy range, or that healthy BMI scale of about 18.5 to 24.9. We see that lower risk of many types of cancers when our weight is within that range. All right, so in terms of why that's important, on this slide, you can actually see there's several different types of cancers. Some of them are cancers that you shared with me today, in terms of things like colon cancer, stomach cancer, breast cancer. In terms of how it links, there's a couple different ways that we think it might happen. First is that as we gain weight, there's a thought that that can increase certain levels of hormones, such as if we think about estrogen. The primary site of estrogen production after menopause is from fat tissue. So if we carry more weight, that can increase the amount of estrogen that we produce and increase our risk for certain types of breast cancers. There's also thought that as we have more fat mass or more fat tissue, we may produce more insulin, and that could create an environment for cancer growth. Or finally, being overweight or obese can create kind of a state of chronic low-grade inflammation, which can create a good environment for cancer growth. That second pillar, that second theme, is exercise or physical activity. And our goal here is to try to get 150 minutes or more of exercise per week. Sometimes that sounds like a lot, 150 minutes, but if we break it up, it makes it a little bit more realistic. So that's about 30 minutes, 5 days a week. And I generally tell my patients, as a dietitian, I'm not overly picky about what it exactly is that you do for exercise, but I want to see that you're moving. So if you're someone that enjoys swimming, that can be a great form of exercise. Or if you're somebody that likes to go to the gym and hop on the elliptical, that can be a great form of exercise. Or if you're someone that likes to do yoga or other group classes, that can be a fantastic form of exercise. So I just want to see that we're moving, that we're getting our heart beating a little bit faster, and perhaps breaking a sweat for about 150 minutes or more a week. If we're someone that likes to do a lot of really vigorous exercise, sometimes we can even use a little bit lower number, and that's about 75 minutes or more of exercise a week. But that means we're working pretty hard during those 75 minutes. So for most of us, it's about 150 minutes or more of exercise each week. So once you get your 150 minutes of exercise, I don't want you to kick your feet up on the couch and turn on your favorite show. I still want you to be moving throughout the day. So even if we get our 30 minutes in, I still want you to try to move more and sit less. We call this NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So essentially ways to incorporate some exercise or activity into our day that isn't necessarily that formal exercise. So it could be some things like walking in the house. So maybe every hour or so you're getting up from sitting, you do a lap around your house or walk back and forth in a hallway or go up and down the stairs. Or if you're talking to friends and family members on the phone, which maybe we're doing more so than ever this last year. So instead of sitting down, maybe we are pacing or walking back and forth as we're on that phone call. Perhaps we wear a pedometer or step counter. We set up our cell phone to track our steps to encourage us to take a few more steps each day. Even doing things like housework or yard work can be good forms of activity. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, just getting up from sitting every hour is a good way to incorporate a little bit more activity into our day. Next, that final pillar, and that is looking at diet. So this is where we'll spend most of our time today. And in terms of cancer prevention, so reducing our risk of cancer or cancer recurrence, we recommend eating more of a plant-based diet. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be on a vegan diet or that you have to be on a vegetarian diet, but we want to try to incorporate more plant-based foods. Things like fruits or vegetables, whole grains and beans and legumes are great examples of some of these plant-based foods. We find that there's lots of different nutrients, things like different vitamins and minerals or antioxidants or phytochemicals in these plant-based foods that can help reduce our risk of various chronic diseases, including cancer. So in the next few slides, I want to explore a little bit more of those nutrients that we find in plant-based foods that can help reduce our risk. So first, I want to talk a little bit more about antioxidants. You might hear this word a lot. Antioxidants essentially are substances that can help block damaging reactions within cells. And it's thought that over time, perhaps some of these reactions can lead to or increase our risk for cancer. So those antioxidants can help reduce some of that damage. We can find antioxidants in a variety of foods. So there's a few examples here on the slide. So for example, vitamin C is a very common nutrient that we think of in cold and flu season, but it's also an antioxidant. Things like citrus and strawberries and melons can be great sources here. I encourage you, not necessarily to hone in on just one specific food, but really think about the overall picture of what you're eating and try to incorporate a variety of these plant-based foods each day so that you ensure your diet has a variety of antioxidants. Next are phytochemicals, and don't be worried if you've never heard this word before. Essentially, phytochemicals are plant chemicals. Phyto is a Greek word for plant. And these are compounds that can help reduce our risk of many chronic diseases, including cancer. And there are actually thousands of different types of phytochemicals. So the few examples I have here on the slide are just a very, very small sampling. There's several different ways that we think this can reduce our risk of cancer. Potentially, we think they act as antioxidants. They could produce enzymes that help deactivate carcinogens or substances that could promote cancer. And also, we think that they could potentially impact cell replication. So some very healthy foods on here, cruciferous vegetables. So those are those vegetables like broccoli and Brussels sprouts and kale and cabbage. Even soy foods, whole grains, teas, especially green tea. These can all be great sources of phytochemicals. Thinking a little bit more about soy foods, this is a very common question that I get amongst my patients is it safe for me to eat soy or should I be avoiding soy? Historically, in the past, there was some concern with soy, but a lot of that research was based on like soy supplements or like pills or powders, for example. And more recent research shows that soy-based food products like soy milk or edamame or tofu could potentially decrease our risk for cancer. So it's fine to consume soy-based foods if you have, say, a history of breast cancer. Some of the research shows up to 2 servings a day can be safe, but even in cultures where they consume more than 2 servings a day, such as cultures in Asia, we still see a lower risk of breast cancer. We just encourage those whole foods, again, soy milk, edamame, tofu are a few examples, rather than more processed forms. So some of those kind of meat substitute products are quite popular right now, but those are pretty processed to get into that form. So I'd rather see something like having edamame for a snack rather than one of those kind of fake meat burgers. Next is fiber. So fiber is kind of that roughage, in a sense, the undigestible portion of plant-based foods. Again, things like fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans, and legumes are all good sources of fiber. And we tend to find that individuals that have a higher intake of fiber have a lower risk of cancer, particularly like colorectal cancer. There's a couple different things that fiber can do within our diet. It can help prevent constipation. It also helps keep things moving at a healthy pace within our digestive tract. So there's a thought that, potentially any carcinogens or those substances that could promote cancer have less contact time with our gut, therefore a lower risk. Fiber also acts as a prebiotic. You may be a little bit more familiar with probiotics. Probiotics are those good, healthy bacteria. Probiotics act as food or fuel for those good bacteria. Also, fibrous foods tend to naturally be lower in calories. So if we think of things like fruits and vegetables, they provide good nutrition. They can help us maintain a healthy body weight without giving us a lot of calories. Another component of plant-based diet is grain products. And with grains, there's two main types of grains that we see. We can see whole grains and we can see refined grains. Whole grain, as the name implies, is made of the whole grain, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm, which are the bran and the germ, for example, are some of those really nutrient-rich portions of the grain. They have some of those antioxidants, phytochemicals, vitamins, and minerals that our body needs. Whereas the refined grains typically have the bran and the germ removed, so they have a little bit less nutrition to them. Some of them might have, say, some of the B vitamins or some of the iron added back to them, but it's always best if we can try to choose the whole grain. Some examples of the whole grain, as you can see on the slide here, are things like oatmeal. So that could be an option for breakfast cereal, or bran flakes, whole wheat bread, or brown rice, or whole wheat pasta. Even popcorn is considered a whole grain. So often I like to encourage you to make some swaps during the day. So say, for example, for breakfast, you normally have like the cream of wheat cereal. Could you choose the oatmeal instead? Or if you are getting a sandwich for lunch, instead of like a white bread or Italian bread, could you opt for a whole wheat bread? Or if you're making rice for dinner, instead of white rice, could you choose the whole grain, that brown rice instead? Sometimes it can be difficult to tell if something truly is a whole grain, especially if we think about lots of different like bread products. There's lots of different varieties or ways to describe bread, and some of them I think are honestly a little bit misleading. Things that say like multi-grain or 12 grain or 7 grain are not always whole grain products. They can be, but sometimes they're more of like a white bread or refined base, and they add some grains to it or some seeds to make it look extra grainy. So what I encourage you to do is look at the ingredient list. So flip that package over, locate the ingredient list, and look to see what that first word is after ingredients. So we want that first word to say whole. So in this case, this happens to be a cereal example. But if we look, the first word after ingredients, it says whole grain oats. Other examples might be whole grain wheat. If we see things like wheat flour or enriched wheat flour, bleached or unbleached flour, those are typically words that would indicate that it is more of a refined grain rather than whole grain.
I think we all.
So we've talked so far a little bit about some of those plant-based components of our diet. But if you recall earlier, I said we want a plant-based or plant-focused diet, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be a vegetarian or that we have to be a vegan. So I want to talk a little bit more about how meats or some of those animal products might fit within our dietary pattern. In terms of cancer prevention, we do recommend trying to limit our intake of red meat. So red meat would be things like beef and pork and lamb and veal. And we try to keep our intake of red meats to about 12 to 18 ounces a week or less. To put that in perspective, if you can think of a deck of cards, so both the height, the width, the depth, all of those those dimensions, that is about a 3-ounce serving of meat. So we could have a couple servings each week that size and be within that 12 to 18 ounces a week or less. However, with that said, we do recommend trying to minimize or avoid processed meats as much as possible. Processed meats would be anything that's been salted or cured or smoked or had preservatives added in some way. That includes lunch meats or deli meats, even like deli turkey or deli chicken. Even if it looks like it's a whole piece of turkey they're slicing off, odds are if it's coming from the deli counter, it's still a processed meat. Or even if you buy it kind of in like those pre-made little tubs, odds are those are still processed meats. Bacon, sausage, hot dogs, ham are other examples of processed meats as well. And in terms of red meats and processed meats, especially for colon cancer, we want to decrease our risk. Regular intake of these processed meats can definitely increase our risk. I never want my patients though, or family members or friends to feel guilty about what they eat. So, say if you do have a processed meat, if it's something that you have on occasion, if you have a hot dog on the 4th of July and, a brat on Memorial Day, maybe a couple other times during the year, I wouldn't necessarily feel guilty about that. But if you're having that hot dog every day for lunch, that's where we have some opportunity for improvement, or maybe we swap that out. Or if typically we have, say, a turkey sandwich for lunch, maybe we do something like egg salad or tuna salad, or some leftover chicken that we mix with a little bit of like mayonnaise as an alternative for lunch, so that we're having less of that processed meat. On this next slide, I have a couple examples or suggestions of how we might go about reducing our intake of red meat. First, we might opt for more poultry, so chicken or turkey or fish or shellfish instead. These white meats, in a sense, we don't see as big of a risk for cancer compared to the red meats or processed meats. Maybe we challenge ourselves to have more meatless meals or meatless days. Maybe you've heard of Meatless Monday before. So perhaps you challenge yourself to have one meatless day each day where you're using things like soy products or beans or nuts as some of your protein sources. Or perhaps if you do have red meat, you have a little bit smaller serving size. So try to keep it to about a 3-ounce portion and try to make it a lean choice. So try to remove some of that visceral fat if you can before the meat product is cooked. Or perhaps you consider using meat in some of those mixed dishes, so stir fries, soups, and casseroles. Typically those incorporate things like grains or vegetables, so we can have a smaller amount of meat, but it makes it feel like it's going a little bit further. And also I want to talk a little bit about beans. So beans are really a nutrition powerhouse. They're packed with protein. They're a great source of nutrition. So they can really be a comparable alternative to meat. So on the slide here, I have a comparison of beans. So this happens to be 1 cup of black beans versus about 3 ounces of a lean meat. We can see that protein is pretty similar between the two, 15 grams in the beans versus 22 grams in the meat. The beans are much lower in fat. They're naturally cholesterol free. They're a fantastic source of fiber. Calories are pretty close, but the beans actually are a wonderful source of iron too. So grilling can be a pretty healthy cooking method, but there is one way that it could increase the risk for cancer, and that's through a formation of a carcinogen that we call HCA. It occurs when meats are cooked at really high temperatures, so it can happen with grilling, but it can also happen with things like deep frying. Aside from this though, grilling can be a really healthy cooking method because we're not adding a lot of extra fat. So I want to talk about some strategies that we can use to grill, with the thought that, in Minnesota, it eventually will be nice. We won't have risk of snow anymore, and we can break those grills out. So what I recommend is using a little bit lower heat. So consider using something like medium heat rather than medium high or high heat. You might consider pre-cooking your meat. So you might bake it or boil it, for example, and then finish it on the grill. So it still gets a little bit of that grilled taste, but it hasn't been cooked completely through on the grill. Also try to avoid flare-ups. Flare-ups are going to be very high concentrated heat sources that can result in a little bit more of the charring. And we think that charring is where some of this reaction occurs. It also can be helpful to marinate your meat too. So some studies have shown that marinating can significantly reduce the formation of this carcinogen. And as an added bonus, marinating also makes your meat nice and flavorful too. And also make sure you're grilling fruits and vegetables. So this risk we see with meat, we don't see the same risk with things like fruits and vegetables. So make sure that you are grilling plenty of those too. The gentleman here in the picture, it looks like he has some kebabs that he's throwing on the grill, maybe some fish as well. So those kebabs, make sure you load them up with some veggies. And if you're looking for a dessert option, things like grilled pineapple or grilled peaches are fantastic as well. I also want to limit our intake of alcohol too. So truly for cancer prevention, it's best not to drink at all. Sometimes for heart health, you hear things like a glass of red wine is a reasonable choice, but truly for cancer prevention, it's best not to drink at all. And truly alcohol is alcohol. So we need to make sure that if we are drinking, we're keeping it in moderation. So for women, that's about 1 drink a day or less. For men, that's about 2 drinks a day or less. And a drink is about 12-ounce beer, about 1 ounce to 1.5 ounces of like a hard liquor, or about 4 to 5 ounces of wine. And there can be certain types of cancers, such as breast cancer, where even 1 drink a day for women or 2 drinks a day for men can increase our risk. So truly, it is best not to drink at all.
Yeah, well, yeah, great.
And then sugar. So this is a very hot topic. I get lots and lots of questions about this. There is a myth floating around that sugar feeds cancer, and I'm here to tell you that is not true. There's no direct link for sugar causing cancer. If we wanted to link them, we might be able to link them in kind of a roundabout way. And we can say that if we're eating a lot of sugar or fat for that matter too, that can provide excess calories in our diet. And those excess calories can contribute to weight gain. And as we talked about earlier, weight gain can be, or being overweight or obese, can be a risk factor for cancer. So if I were to pick on these donuts that are on the slide here, cupcakes, if I were to eat tons of donuts for breakfast and lunch and dinner, that might increase my risk of cancer, because odds are I'm probably going to gain a decent amount of weight by doing that. But if overall I'm eating a healthy, balanced diet and I have a donut every once in a while as a sweet treat, that itself should not increase my risk for cancer. So with that said, we do recommend being mindful of our sugar intake, just because if we think about a lot of these sugar foods, like the donuts, or there's some jelly beans or cupcakes on the side here, these are really not nutrient dense foods. Nutrient dense meaning lots of vitamins and minerals and other compounds that our body needs, while being lower in calories. So we typically don't eat the donut because we think it's packed with nutrition. We eat it because we like it. So we want to make sure that our diet has plenty of healthy foods, but there still is a little bit of wiggle room for some of those sugar containing foods. And then in terms of supplements, I don't recommend supplements for cancer prevention. There's a couple different reasons why. First and foremost, studies have been pretty disappointing. When we look at supplement use, we really don't see that same reduction in cancer risk that we see with a healthy diet. In fact, there's even some studies that suggest that potentially those supplements could increase our risk for certain types of cancers. Also, supplements are not regulated like food. They don't necessarily have to prove that they're safe or that they're effective before they're put on the marketplace. So supplements really should not be a replacement for a healthy diet. And also there's a thought that supplements lack what we call synergy. So we think that nutrients in food could work together in ways that we don't fully understand to help reduce our risk of cancer or other diseases. So if we don't completely understand how they interact together, it's going to be hard for us to replicate that in a supplement. So those are a few reasons why I don't recommend supplements for cancer prevention. With that said, though, there are times when we might recommend, or I might recommend a supplement to someone. So again, food first. My thought is if we're eating a healthy, balanced diet, we should be able to get all or most of the nutrients that we need from food, where supplements would not be necessary. So if I get all the nutrients that I need from food, more is not always better. You can't necessarily get an A++ in nutrition, just that A is good enough. But supplements can be used in the case of poor intake. So say, for example, I have an allergy to dairy products and I have very limited dairy in my diet. Odds are my diet might be low in calcium and vitamin D, so a supplement might be appropriate there. Or perhaps I have a deficiency in a certain nutrient, then a supplement might be appropriate to help bring that level back up. But I always do recommend checking with your healthcare provider or your primary care or your oncologist before starting any new supplement. But I also want to talk a little bit about organic foods, and this might be a little bit surprising to hear, but we consider this, or I consider this to be a very personal choice. There's no evidence that pesticide exposure through food increases our risk for cancer. Nor is there evidence that organically grown foods are more nutritious for us. The biggest thing is that we want to eat more fruits and vegetables. Eating enough fruits and vegetables far, far, far outweighs any potential risk of pesticide exposure. In fact, typically when we think about pesticides, we measure them in really, really small amounts. We measure them in parts per million or parts per billion. So if we have that, it's 0.000% of the food, so teeny small amount. And also when we wash our fruits and vegetables, that gets rid of all or most of that pesticide residue. And so that's really important to wash our fruits and vegetables, whether we're buying organically grown or whether we're buying conventionally grown, we want to wash them. If you have concerns about pesticide exposure, again, washing is one of the best things that you can do. Other things that you can do is if you have, like, say, a lettuce or head of lettuce, just maybe remove some of those outer leaves. Look for produce that's in good shape. Look for ones without like decay or cuts or mold. Or even things like meats, try to remove some of that visible fat, because if that animal was storing pesticides, more of it would be concentrated in the fat tissue compared to the lean tissue. And again, eating enough fruits and vegetables outweighs any potential risk of pesticide exposure. A common question I get related to this is there's some lists out there called like the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15, looking at supposedly, the Dirty Dozen being 12 items that are higher in pesticides versus the Clean 15 items being lower. I do not worry about those lists. Even if something is on that so-called Dirty Dozen list, washing it can get rid of most of that pesticide residue. And I think I've said this a couple of times now, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables far outweighs any risk there. So kind of in summary of some of those things that we've talked about, those main themes: be at a healthy body weight. Our goal is ultimately to try to be at that healthy body weight throughout life. But trying to aim for the healthy body weight now is also important too. We want to be active each day. So trying to get about 30 minutes of activity or exercise, as well as trying to be active and moving throughout the remainder of the day. We want to eat a variety of more plant-based foods, so fruits and vegetables, whole grains and beans, for example. Limit foods that are higher in fat and sugar, just with the thought that they have more calories, and those calories can contribute to weight gain. And then stick to food sources of nutrients rather than supplements. On this next slide, I do have a couple of resources. So the American Cancer Society, the American Institute for Cancer Research, and Oncology Nutrition Dietitians are three very reputable organizations in which you might find questions to, just because I know the internet can be a wealth of information, sometimes good information, sometimes bad information. So these are definitely good resources to check out. Do you have any questions? Or I should say, what questions do you have?
There you go.
There's
Well,
no
Madeline, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, there's no such thing as a silly question, so don't be afraid to ask.
Well, I was going to preface this by saying maybe it's silly, but you know, cold cereals like bran flakes or any of the kind of generic cereals that don't have a lot of sugar and chocolate and everything added. It seems as though I've always heard a lot about the carbs in them. And, you know, and I've always been a cold cereal eater, but they don't seem like empty calories, and yet they're very high in carbs.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts about that? I mean,
Yeah, that's definitely not a silly question. That's a great question. So, you know, things like fruits and cereals can be decent sources of carbohydrates. Like, but if you're choosing some of those that you mentioned that are not necessarily like those sugar coated or frosted ones, if you do, you know, like bran cereals or Cheerios or like a shredded type of wheat that doesn't have the frosting on it, those carbohydrates are naturally occurring. So I wouldn't be concerned about them. You know, if you were down and having 10 bowls of cereal at once, you know, maybe we have a little bit more room to try to give some balance. But I think if you're having a normal serving of the cereal, you know, if you add some fruit, if you have some low fat milk or yogurt even with it, I think that can be a very good balanced meal. When I think about carbs, to add a little bit more to that, you know, what I typically want to limit is those added sugars. So it's added during processing or manufacturing. So if I take that cereal and add a lot of sugar coating to it, you know, that adds extra carbohydrates, it adds some calories without adding a lot of nutrition to the product.
okay, thanks.
What other questions do you have? I know there's some burning questions out there.
What about some of this plant-based meats that they have, like this Beyond Meat, you know?
Yeah, like the Beyond burgers or the Impossible burgers. So I don't think nutrition is always black and white in terms of yes, it's good or no, it's not. I think it kind of falls on a spectrum in the sense of, you know, if we think about, we talked about like red meats and processed meats are things that we want to try to limit, and we want to try to choose more plant-based foods. And I think some of those burger products kind of fall within the middle there. You know, they're quite processed to get it into that form. So if I take an Impossible burger or Beyond burger, and if I cut it open and look inside of it, I'm probably not going to be able to tell you all of those ingredients just by looking at it. So it's processed to get it into that form. But I think it can be a little bit better choice than say like a processed meat. So it kind of falls in the middle. You know, if we could you know, make a veggie burger at home using things like beans or soy or other plant-based ingredients, I think that would be best. But I think some of those plant-based burgers kind of fall in the middle there. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And also to add a little bit to that too, you know, sometimes they can have a decent amount of fat or sodium to them as well. And say you need to limit sodium for another health condition, you know, those can sometimes add a decent amount of salt to our diet.
Oh, okay.
Good question.
Hey, Madeline, I have a question for you. What's your thoughts on dairy products? Are there certain dairy products that maybe should be avoided versus some that are quite beneficial?
Yeah. I always recommend lower fat dairy products. So if we're doing milk, something like skim milk or 1% milk or low fat yogurts. Cheeses tend to be a little bit higher in fat. So I do recommend using those in moderation. So like think of them more as like a condiment. So something that we add a little bit to our meal to add some flavor rather than being a major component of the meal. Sometimes our recommendations for dairy products can vary a little bit depending on our individual health situation, and even within certain types of cancer. So, you know, if we think about colon cancer, for example, sometimes higher intakes of like calcium or dairy products can actually help reduce our risk. Whereas there's been some more recent studies that look at, say, for example, prostate cancer and find that higher intakes could potentially increase our risk. So I think that, if we're going to have dairy products, definitely just make sure it's those lower fat versions. So try to limit things like whole milk or even 2% milk.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
There is a lot of coffee consumed every day, and I'm wondering about coffee as a contributing risk factor.
Yeah, I think coffee is fine to consume. I think a lot of people kind of think coffee is their bad habit. If we are buying some of those like fancy coffee house style drinks, sometimes those can have a lot of extra calories to them. But if we think about it, like a plain cup of black coffee, I think that can be a very reasonable choice. Kind of thinking outside of the realm of cancer, even there's some evidence that coffee can be good for kidney health or liver health too. I saw a study recently that showed that up to 25 cups of coffee a day was considered safe. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. I don't know if I could function on 25 cups a day. I'd probably be sitting here bouncing off the walls. But I think if you have a couple cups of coffee each day, ideally black coffee, I think that's very reasonable. And coffee can even be a source of some antioxidants too. If you find that you're having trouble sleeping, looking at, when you're drinking your coffee, trying to have it early in the day, try to avoid some of those caffeinated products in the afternoon or the evening hours. Or if you're feeling, kind of jittery, that might be a sign that you're having a little bit too much caffeine or coffee.
I heard you.
Done.
I was thinking about John, two of John's favorite foods are peanuts and bananas. And I know they aren't the lowest calorie things you could eat, but relatively healthy, aren't they?
Yeah, so bananas and peanuts fall within that realm of plant-based foods. If we can think about peanuts, if we can, I would recommend choosing like unsalted or lightly salted nuts. But also we don't want to look too much at just one particular food, because even though those might be some of our favorite foods, we are probably eating other foods too. So say I'm eating, a fruit at breakfast and lunch and dinner, I'm getting plenty each day. Maybe I have a vegetable at breakfast and lunch and dinner as well. But then you ask me, well, what do you have for the rest of your meal? And I say, well, I'm stopping by McDonald's or Burger King for their other components of the meal. Then it might outweigh some of those protective components. So, definitely things like bananas or peanuts can be a very reasonable addition to our diet, but we want to make sure that our whole diet or the whole picture of our diet is nutritious foods as well. That makes sense?
One thing that I heard about almonds, I love almonds. And when I attended American Heart Association meetings, they'd give us 18 almonds in a little packet each day because they're healthy. But just being aware, I know that a serving of almonds is 170 calories. I watched that, but again, when you read about them, they give you so much good nutrition that you just have to build that 170 calories into your diet and take away something else that might be high in calories.
Yeah, nuts overall, are a little bit higher in calories, but that's because they contain a lot of healthy fats too. So a typical serving size of nuts is going to what fits on just a flat layer of your palm. So nuts or the almonds, I think you said 18. I've also heard from the almond board too, it's like 20 to 22 almonds sometimes
22,
too.
yeah,
So
22.
it's a little bit,
under.
it's a smaller serving. So if we grab a big handful of nuts, that might be multiple servings of nuts at that point.
Could you address the hard and processed cheeses?
Yeah, so processed cheeses, if we think of like American cheese or Velveeta cheeses, definitely I do encourage trying to minimize those. Even some of those hard cheeses like not American cheddar or Swiss or Parmesan, those do have a lot more saturated fat, which is kind of that solid fat, a little less ideal for things like heart health. So I would recommend being mindful of how much we use. Again, kind of think of them more as that condiment. So we use a little bit to add some flavor to foods rather than a large component of a meal. Does that answer your question, Darlene?
Yeah, I was just thinking of things like you see information that Velveeta and some of those cheeses are not considered particularly healthy, that the hard cheeses were better for you.
Yeah. So I like to think of some of those natural versus processed cheese. So natural cheese would be, our Swiss, our mozzarella, Parmesan, cheddar, versus the processed cheese would be the Velveeta, the American, the Cheez Whiz. If you want to get into kind of the nitty gritty of food manufacturing and food science, they technically classify things like American cheese as like a cheese product rather than a true cheese. And so we really don't see, some of the compounds, like as much calcium, for example, in some of those. So do try to choose those natural cheeses, the cheddar, the Swiss, the mozzarella, the Parmesan, or similar varieties instead of some of those processed cheeses. Any other questions?
I know there's so many different types of cancer, but are there any things that you recommend that really stand out, that really, you find should be avoided with, say, radiation treatments if someone's going through a series of radiation or chemo? Are there any foods like Megan mentioned early on, so many kinds of treatment or meds can be constipating for people. And are there any foods that seem to be pretty consistently good through different kinds of treatments?
Yeah, kind of as an overall picture as we're going through treatment. So it could be radiation or it could be chemotherapy, for example. Nutritionally, if we can follow these guidelines that we talked about today in terms of healthy eating, that's fantastic. But sometimes side effects from treatment can impact, what we eat or how much we can eat. So we really focus on getting enough calories, getting enough protein, getting enough fluid each day. So sometimes we do have to push some of the healthy eating guidelines to the back burner and focus on just getting enough nutrition in each day. So we find that if we can eat better during treatment, we tend to do better and tolerate it better. What other questions do you have?
Any specific foods any of you thought you had to avoid or should avoid during treatment that maybe, it was a misnomer?
Yeah, and in general, there's really no foods that you have to avoid. There might be, with certain like medications, for very specific types of cancer, sometimes there might be certain restrictions, but overall, there's really not any foods that you have to avoid. Again, sometimes the more restrictions that we put on ourselves, sometimes the harder it is to get adequate nutrition. And if we are not getting enough nutrition, that puts us at risk for things like weight loss. And ultimately, our goal during cancer treatment, so chemotherapy or radiation included, is we want to maintain our weight. I know earlier today we talked about for cancer prevention, it's important to maintain a healthy body weight. But even if you are, say, overweight or obese, during cancer treatment, I typically don't want you to lose any weight. Or if you do lose weight, I want it to be intentional and at a very slow pace. So kind of as a rule of thumb, again, there's no specific foods that we'd have to avoid.
I was going to ask those of us who do have cancer about hydration.
Yeah.
If drinking enough water is a challenge to people who are receiving treatment, or maybe helpful hints about making it more palatable, or just
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah, sometimes hydration can be difficult for a variety of different reasons. One example might be if things are tasting different. Sometimes things, normal things that we might like, say water, say coffee, no longer taste good to us. And so, perhaps experimenting a little bit with other beverages. Sometimes things that are tart, like lemonade, might taste better. Maybe like something like a Gatorade or Powerade or other sports drinks might taste better. Making sure we keep fluids with us is important too. Sometimes if you're going through treatment, you might have lots of appointments or you might be away from home. So carrying something like a water bottle with you so that you have some easy access to fluids is important. Maybe adding a little bit of flavoring to your water to make it taste a little bit better can be another reasonable choice to stay well hydrated too. And typically when we think about our fluid needs, it's just that it's fluid, not just water. So most of the things that we can drink can count towards our hydration each day. Some of our caffeinated products like coffee or some of our soft drinks or sodas are not quite as hydrating as other fluids, but they still do count towards our overall fluid recommendations or guidelines for the day. So we want to stay well hydrated. Typically, I like to see like 64 to 80 ounces of fluid a day, and choose things that taste good or that sound good as we're going through treatment, because sometimes it does get harder to maintain that adequate fluid.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Maybe amounts of food and frequency of eating to maintain diet. Sometimes it's hard to eat enough to consume enough calories, but taken in smaller amounts.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very common as we're going through treatment that our appetite may not be what it used to be in the past. And so, our standard of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, kind of those 3 meals each day, we might not be able to eat the amount of food that we're used to eating at those meals. So eating small or more frequent meals where maybe we're eating 5 or 6 times a day, we're eating still breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but it's a much smaller amount, and we're incorporating, say, mid-morning or mid-afternoon or evening snack or a combination of those in, but they're more snack-like meals, and that can be a way to help ensure that we're getting enough nutrition in. Or sometimes even things like smoothies or protein shakes, can be some options for snacks to get a little bit of protein and to get some additional calories in each day. I've even had some patients that will do kind of like almost a grazing type of approach where they may not necessarily have their defined breakfast and lunch and dinner, but they're kind of constantly snacking on little things throughout the day to try to make sure they're getting adequate nutrition in. And I think I'd mentioned earlier, we focus on calories, we focus on protein. And so protein can be things like milk or yogurt or cheese, could be eggs, could be any of our meats, chicken or turkey or seafood products might be some choices. Nuts or nut butters might be some options, or protein shakes or protein bars, protein powders. Even things like soy products can all be reasonable ways to get some of that protein in. And our body utilizes that protein best if we can try to spread it throughout the day too. So if we have a little bit of protein at most of those times that we eat, rather than trying to have most of our protein in a one meal or snack.
I was trying to think if there were any questions about the upcoming summertime, if we can envision that in with the heat, but I guess hydration is probably the biggest thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so normally our fluid requirements are about 64 to 80 ounces a day. But if we are in a warm climate or if we're physically active, sweating, that can increase our fluid requirements each day. So if we are outside, if it's a warm day and you're sweating a lot, do make sure that you are drinking plenty of fluids. Sometimes even just looking at your urine can be a little bit of an an indicator of your hydration status. If it's kind of that lemonade or a pale lemonade color, that can be a sign that we are adequately hydrated, versus if it's starting to look a little darker, if it's looking more like Mountain Dew like, that can be a sign that we might need to increase our fluid intake.
Megan, any thoughts you have of what patients complain of or talk about? I think boy, Madelynn's really covered a wide variety, but I was just thinking of some of the
Well,
things.
I mean, our patients have a whole different issue. So, when they have an obstruction, then all of a sudden we're telling them, okay, no fiber, no fruits or vegetables. You got to keep it bland. It's got to be the white rice, the white potatoes. And so it's kind of contradictory to what you would think would be normal nutrition. And so sometimes our problem has been when we send them to see a nutritionist or a dietitian, it hasn't been that helpful, only because it's kind of contradictory to what the normal nutrition advice is. And each cancer type has their own kind of issues, and bowel obstruction from adhesions and actual cancer is kind of the issue. So it's not a constipation issue. It's a transit issue and lack of motility. So, I mean, it's kind of a whole nother realm to get into.
Yeah. And I guess it just says over and over that every case is individual.
It is, it really
Everybody's
is. So
special in that way, that their needs are all different, and it's important to acknowledge that. Right.
but I am a proponent as well of getting your your nutrition from your diet and not taking supplements. I don't think supplements do a whole lot. Your body really wasn't made to absorb them from pills and supplements. And so when patients are on chemotherapy, I usually say that less is more. So, if the multivitamin and, extra supplements they're taking is actually causing more GI upset, I say, let's back off on those for the time being.
Any other thoughts or questions? We've got the experts here, so. So you're saying the role of a dietitian in medical oncology is fairly new, in that when someone's going through the oncology department, they obviously can request to see a dietitian, but that's really a good point to know, is that there's someone specialized in oncology. That is exciting.
Oh, I'm very excited about that, just because it's so unique. And so, Madelynn, there's so much to learn, because every tumor type is going to have their own little eccentricities that are going to make recommendations different.
Absolutely.
Just one last thought I'd have, like Randy and Linda, you mentioned you experienced cancer in both your parents, and Darlene, and were there any things that you noticed that made eating so much more or non-palatable, or special problems that you would have been able to wanted to ask at the time? Again, everybody's individualized.
I think there was just a general, I think in Linda's case, her parents' case, there was general, lot of bad after effects with the chemo and things like that, the metallic taste at that time they were going through. So I think they had a lot of issues just eating normally, I think, from what I can remember.
And maybe just, yeah, now hearing that up front and knowing that those are problems that arise.
And taste changes are tough in the sense that it can take a while for our tastes to return more towards kind of our normal in a sense. And we really don't have a lot of good interventions for some of those taste changes. So that kind of metallic taste that you mentioned, sometimes that can be worse with things like red meat. So sometimes looking at other sources of protein to make sure that we're getting enough, or that we're being mindful of our use of like metal-based utensils, perhaps choosing things like plastic utensils can help, but it's never going to completely make that metallic taste go away, during that time that we're eating.
I think the thing we noticed quite a bit was definitely the weight loss, especially in Linda's dad. And unfortunately, that was quite a noticeable effect, I think, as the cancers progressed and got worse.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we could really do a whole lot about it, but it was difficult.
What kind of cancer did you say that your father had?
Pancreatic.
Okay. Yeah, weight loss is quite common with pancreatic cancer.
And probably the most difficult thing is that when we had family gatherings where he was included, the whole family kind of got together and had a meal, and he was doing his Ensure, or was that the product? Was this more of a liquid product he was drinking, and everybody else was kind of gathering around having the normal meal. So I felt kind of bad for him in that aspect, that he wasn't, for whatever reason, wasn't doing a normal meal with us.
The being together is important and having the family support, but you're right, we just take so much for granted in our common traditions. And I think when you said that, I was thinking Thanksgiving or with pumpkin pie and things that are so traditional, and then with someone being there that just can't eat those things.
Yeah.
Well, this has really been great discussion, Madelynn. We just thank you so very much. I'm sure questions may come up after the fact, but they arise as the need does.
Very informative.
Thank you.
Are there any things before we start to think about closing? I mean, any discussion or any, any thoughts people have? We want to talk probably more about nutrition in the future. And I guess as questions and needs arise, we'll think of other topics. Nutrition has been one we wanted for a long time. And we really struck it lucky when I found that Madelynn was, worked in general nutrition and endocrinology, but was also doing this. So as topics come up and things that you want to learn more about, just let us know. And we may come back to you with a few questions now and again, Madelynn, but thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
It was just a great discussion. I'm sure anybody doesn't have any more questions that have come to the surface before we close.